Vaishali, welcome to the Democratizing SEO podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you so much for being on. We're going to talk today about knowledge graphs, and we're going to have an introductory session on knowledge graphs because I think this is a very fascinating area, and I myself am getting into it, and I know my audience is also going to find this very interesting. So, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. Now, you're a knowledge engineer. How would you describe what a
Yes.
knowledge engineer does?
So I'd say that a knowledge engineer primarily works firsthand with knowledge graphs, deals with data ingestion into them, maintaining knowledge graphs, building taxonomies and ontologies to make sure you understand what's in your knowledge graph. It can really vary. It can also be productionizing knowledge graphs or sourcing a vendor to use. There's some open source ones, there's some paid ones. There's a wide range of things, and I think it's now becoming more of a common role that you pick up things that entail like productionizing and things like that. Because I think maybe in the past, I've not been in the role for a super long time, but I know it's full of a lot of academia, and a lot of people have a lot of research knowledge and have been working on things for a very long time. So it's kind of coming out more of a role to in companies more so now than before.
hmm I'm noticing that as well. I'm on LinkedIn quite often, and I always ask myself, what does a knowledge engineer do? Because I'm seeing this role very prominently at big tech companies. And for a non-technical person, what is a knowledge graph? How would you describe that?
So it's a way of storing data, but as opposed to being trying to explain in a non-technical way, as opposed to being a relational database, so something that's got rows and columns, it's storing things in a graph instead. It means that the data you ingest can it's a much more flexible way of storing data. So instead of having data that needs to conform to a certain schema, which you usually have in a table, the idea is with a knowledge graph, you can continually expand it and create ways of storing knowledge as opposed to feeling like you need to conform to a box. It's a really great way of storing lots of different types of data as well. You can store it does support a lot of data types, but the idea is it's flexible, it can be built upon, and you can always add to it as opposed to feeling like you're kind of stuck in one way.
Hmm. Okay, so let's use a live example, real life example. I own a business. I'm in the tech space, let's say. Let's say I own StreamYard, right? Why would I need a knowledge engineer for my business?
What's your business?
StreamYard. So I'm a competitor of Zoom, Riverside as well.
Okay. Okay. Let me think. Why would you need a knowledge engine? So I guess
People use my
it
service for a lot of live broadcasting, and I
yeah.
have tons of data, user data.
So you could, again, it depends on your use case. You might want to do this. You don't need to use a knowledge graph to do this, but you can. You could also just use this, store this information in a table, for example. But if you stored, if a user was recording items on your platform and this was stored in the knowledge graph, you could then try and create links for this episode to perhaps other episodes that have been recorded either on the platform or somewhere else, and add those as links to the initial episode itself. So you could find things that are similar to it, or things that might be useful to be linked to it, and continually expand that as there might be new episodes being recorded every day, but they still might be able to be related back to yours. So it can always be added into your graph. Um, I'm trying to think without being too specific. That's one way of using it, but I do think it really depends on your use case. It's also great for storing a large amount of data. So I guess if you were dealing with a lot of users, for example, you could use it.
When you say data, do you mean like customer data, as in subscribers or people who are users of my service as a business?
Yeah, I would say, yeah.
So how did people store data before? Let's say I'm a business with 1,000 customers. How did businesses store data prior to using some sort of knowledge graph technology?
So I definitely think it was used, relational databases were used, and I think they are still used. Um, I think sometimes if you were to use a knowledge graph to store just customer data, it might, it can work. It might not be the most ideal. If you compare it to, I don't want to go on too much of a tangent, but if you compare it to Google, for example, Google has its own knowledge graph. It's a way of storing facts that they can show users really quickly because it's all contained within their graph. But if you were to use it for users, you could, but it would be more, I feel like if you had customers, it would make more sense to use a relational database because you might be knowing what you're expecting from them
Hmm.
compared to if you were using something that was collecting a large variety of information. Because if you're dealing with customers, you kind of know what you want from them in terms of your data collection. For like, if they were placing an order or if they were using your service and they were a user and you contained all their user information, you generally have to ask them for all of that information so you know what you want from them. But if you were working with a large variety of data and you want to make sure you want to link, you want to make sure you understand it and link it without having to be really strict on what you want, then I think a knowledge graph might be more suitable.
Let's stick with Google as an example. Why do you think they have a knowledge graph?
So I think it's a really easy way to store lots of information. Um, it can, you can always add to it. So you can always store lots of facts about something. So if you had a company, for example, if we were talking about Facebook and we were looking at their key numbers, like the number of employees they have, where their headquarters are, what industry they're in. All of these things can be stored really simply in a graph and it can all be connected to Facebook, but we can expand on that and then we can kind of find out where all of their headquarters around the world are and maybe how many employees across their different headquarters there are. It's a really flexible way of storing data, but making sure you can have lots of data in one place.
Hmm. As a user, then, how does a knowledge graph benefit me? A user wouldn't have a knowledge graph, but let's say I'm a user of Google. I search on Google. How does Google have a knowledge graph of what I've searched for benefit me as a user, as a searcher?
So you could look for lots of different things and Google would be able to understand what you were looking for depending on your search term. So I know we kind of understand how Google works. You look for something and it will pretty much search the whole internet and it will look for links that relate to what you've searched for. But the idea is they probably have something when you're looking at a company, for example, and you search for it and you get a little box on the side that displays like a snapshot of everything that it is maybe most useful about the company. The idea is you probably search for something and even if you added something, I don't know, if you typed in Facebook 2023 or something, the idea is they would be able to understand what you mean and reconcile that to one of their nodes in their knowledge graph, so they know what you're talking about, and that's stored as a fact in their knowledge graph, because they can't store every search input into their graph, but the idea is they would understand what the search term means, and that's what would be represented. That node would be represented in the graph, would show up on your web page, because that's what they understand you to be looking for.
Is this why all platforms then, whether a search-based platform or a social media platform, TikTok, LinkedIn, heck, Facebook, right? Is this why then they're all focusing on knowledge graphs, investing big or betting big, as they like to say, on knowledge graphs, because it's an easy way to have data points organized for their users?
I would say so. I think it's been researched for a long time. A lot of people use knowledge graphs, but it's becoming, even though it is common, it's becoming more common. And I think it's kind of like, I'm someone who works in this industry, and even as a junior, it's hard to find certain things that suit you, or to work with and figure out how to use some of the technologies, compared to if you are coding in like Python or Java. Finding something on Stack Overflow is really easy. And I'd say it's not as easy when looking for problems with knowledge graphs, let's say. So it's becoming more popular because I'm finding it more easy to look for these things. And I think businesses are understanding that there's a lot of benefits to it. And maybe it's something that they didn't really invest in before because they might have not thought it was super important. But I think everything is changing so rapidly now that you have to
Oh,
kind
yeah.
of understand you have to know what's out there in order to be able to figure out what's the best for you.
Is it beneficial for a company to have their the facts about their business within the knowledge graphs of these big tech companies?
I would say yes. Again, Google as an example, it's a really good, I think I've read a little bit about it, but I think you can try and apply to be on their knowledge panel, which is part of their knowledge graph. And it just means that it should help with traction to your business. I know I'm not 100% sure, but I think it probably has a lot to do with SEO as well. So
It
if you're
does.
able to, if you're able to get the traction, and if you're able to get I might be wrong here, but if you're able to get a spot in the knowledge graph and in the knowledge panel, then if anything, it will help your business out. So it would make sense for you to be within these businesses' knowledge graphs, depending on whether it fits and if it makes sense. Google's a really easy example. I think Facebook has a knowledge graph, but I'm not sure how all of the companies use it.
How would one know if a big tech company has a knowledge graph? I mean, with Google, it's quite, because they have their knowledge panels, right? It's clear that they're using a
Yeah.
knowledge graph technology. I've been quite curious about this. So for a lot of these big tech companies, I've been searching on LinkedIn if they have a knowledge engineer or a machine
Yeah.
learning expert or solutionist or something like that, right? And I'm finding quite interesting information from this search alone. But is there like a better way to find out if these big tech companies have a knowledge graph? Because I'm assuming they all have one.
Yeah. Possibly. I feel like your method might make sense because there's a lot of different roles that can be involved with working with a knowledge graph. You can be a knowledge engineer per se, but again, this role might mean different things at different places.
Mm-hmm.
I know being a a content architect. I've seen that before with some folks in the knowledge industry, a taxonomist, an ontologist. There's loads of different roles that can be involved with it. So maybe looking up those roles, but also maybe sifting through like their articles as well, maybe on LinkedIn. I think people like to talk about them using knowledge graphs more so now than before. It does seem like it's becoming more popular, so people want to speak about it and how it's useful, and people are learning about it, so people want to make sure that they are demonstrating what they know about it to show people that we know what we're doing, we're using it, why aren't you, kind of thing.
For a company that is interested in attaining a knowledge graph, or sorry, is that the right term, attaining a knowledge graph, or having a knowledge graph? It's having, right? Having a knowledge graph.
I'd say having. Yeah.
Is there a specific point you would say, okay, at this point within the business, they should invest in a knowledge engineer, or should they invest in it from the very beginning of the business, for example?
I think it's more it's more of looking at your use case. I don't think it's always useful for all businesses to have a knowledge graph from the get-go. First of all, like, depending on your size, if you're a small company that's not dealing with a lot of data, it probably doesn't make much sense for you to have one. But if you're a bigger business and if you feel like you're using a lot of data and you need to, it's like simple things. Like, there's really small ways that might suggest you might need one. Like, if you're using a relational database and if you're using SQL and you have to join lots of tables, and you're joining a lots of table means your data is probably quite interlinked, and you might benefit from a knowledge graph as opposed to having a relational database.
In layman's terms, what does that mean, joining a lot of tables?
So, like, if you had, I don't know, let me think of an example. If you were talking about people, I don't know, let's say for like hypothetical sake, it was a really big company that stored user data information and they stored things about people. And we stored these all in lots of different tables. So perhaps the person itself, this is a really hypothetical example because I don't know how many companies would have this much data on you, like in one place. But yeah, it was your address, your city, your country. That would be one table, and then in another, it might be your employment, and okay, let me break it down. Your house, where you live, and that's it. And then you and your employment, and then your employment address. But there was like another table that stored all the addresses in the UK. And if you wanted to figure out where somewhere was, so you knew where your house, this company knew where your house's postal code was, but didn't know where it was exactly in terms of an address. And it joined with the list of addresses. That's a really basic example, but there are cases when you're working with data, especially if you're talking to someone who's a data analyst or just working with data in general, that they might have to join lots of tables on one person or like one product or what else, like a transaction. Like, it could be anything, but the more drawings you're making and the more you find that your data is being linked in lots of ways, if it's being stored in multiple tables and you need to join on this one thing, that kind of indicates that, oh, maybe you need a knowledge graph because you're trying to find out lots of information from lots of different places, but you can kind of try and centralize it all to try and instead maybe make that one thing a node and lots of other things are related to it. So I'd say if you feel like you're...
Sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
No.
Well, going back to your original question, like, when do you think businesses might need one? It's more like if you feel like you're dealing with lots of data, or maybe like lots of repetition in some ways, not like the exact duplicates of each other, but like aliases of each other, or things that are kind of representing the same thing in lots of different ways. That's when you might start to think, we're not storing our data in the best way in this case. Maybe we should start to think about a knowledge graph. And I'd say the best, before you even employ a knowledge engineer, the first thing that would make the most sense is to speak to, if you've got anyone who's working in data, speak to them and ask them, because they will also understand data architecture and data structure. Speak to them and find out what their pain points are, and maybe use that to compare against benefits of a knowledge graph. And if it makes sense, that's when you can actually think about creating one, and then think about if you want to, then you think about actually having a knowledge engineer.
I've also noticed these big tech firms, let's use Google as an example again, they almost source information from a specific place. And in Google's knowledge panels, Wikipedia tends to come up quite often. Wikipedia, IMDb. So do these big tech companies sort of like use each other's knowledge graphs or knowledge database or nodes, or do they borrow from each other in that sense?
They may. I'm not 100% sure, but I know that Wikipedia has, I think they're owned by Wikipedia. I'm not 100% sure, but there's Wikidata that has a lot of, it kind of has a lot of things that are in Wikipedia represented as knowledge graph items. So, for example, and that's all open source. Wikidata is all open source, so you can freely use it. So it could be that Google is using their services and using them as entry points into their graph. So they're also stored in Google's graph, for example. I guess it would, once it's open source, it becomes like anyone can use it. So if it's there, I guess in their head, they might be like, why not?
all of these big terms bitten big on knowledge graphs. If you were to imagine what they're thinking ahead of time, right? What future are they creating?
I think a future where we are looking at data in another way. Perhaps, I think I've been hearing, or I've heard about how some businesses or organizations struggle to really use their data to drive the decisions. Maybe using a knowledge graph, it is a fundamental change. Like, if you're not used to using them, it's a really big change for your company and for your business, but it can have a lot of benefits if you do. So I feel like it would help to push for change in a business and push for really rethinking or redesigning how you deal with data, but it could come with a lot of benefits. So it's a lot about looking forward and looking into the future, but planning ahead, I would say.
And businesses, they are very much reliant. They are reliant on these big tech firms, right, in order to generate traffic, in order to eventually get revenue from users via these big tech firms. What should they be doing, businesses, right now to prepare for the future that these big tech companies are creating?
With knowledge, like, so what should businesses be doing to deal with these companies?
Is there anything that they should be doing in terms of repositioning themselves to ensure that they are shown to users on these big tech platforms?
I think understanding, it's kind of vague, but understanding where these businesses are kind of going with what they're planning to do. So like, for example, like you've said, you find out about them, you've been interested in hearing about them and researching about them. I think like trying to understand how they work is a really big deal. Like Google's knowledge graph has been around for ages. It's been around since 2012, if I'm right. And people do know about it, but maybe, like, for example, if you're a small business, you might not know about it, but knowing about Google's, for example, could still be beneficial to you. So I think, again, this kind of ties back into thinking about data and working with data, understanding when things are changing and trying to make sure you're on top of it and reading around it. I'm sure businesses do this anyway, but looking at it through a different lens, like looking at what's coming up in terms of data is a lot different to like what's coming up in terms of business or sales, or just looking at what businesses are doing in terms of their strategy is very different. It's similar, but I feel like, yeah, if you look at what they're doing in terms of their data and why they're making the decisions they are, it might help you to understand how you can benefit from the way they're doing things, or how you can find your way to fit in to make sure you get the traction you need as well.
As an SEO, whenever I search for something, I have to say, of course, I'm biased, but I try to think of what the average user expects from search. And I think that way because of course, what users expect influences the changes that we see in search, right? So when the everyday person uses product services from these big tech firms, as from your point of view, as a knowledge expert, a knowledge engineer, what do you think users expect from these tech firms, which are making them make the changes that they are, or influencing them rather, to make the changes that we're seeing?
You might have to rephrase the question. So when they're
So
searching for things,
is it a case of users expect these big tech firms to know everything about what they're seeking, what the user is seeking?
mm,
The way
maybe.
the reason I ask this question is when I have a look at Google search generative experience, right, which they have in the States and they're testing in several other places. So they have a documentation on why they're creating it, and it's very much a marketing document, right? So not technical at all, but something within that marketing doc made me say there's something interesting about the reasoning for this new change. Of course, AI is influencing them, but a term that I keep coming back to whenever I think of SGE is speed. Speed is a big factor, right, for searchers. And my belief is because of social media, because of AI, users now expect information accurate. Yes, accuracy is first, but also speed. They want information as quickly as possible. So with these knowledge graphs that these big tech firms are creating, is it a case of they've seen with their research data, users expect them, the big tech companies, to know everything about everything, to be the source of knowledge and to have as accurate a data as possible, hence the better way of organizing information. So is it a case of, yes, users have an expectation of these big tech firms which they are fulfilling, or are the big tech firms being led by something else?
I think I might agree with the first. I think, like you've said, users want to get what they want a lot more quickly. And I think businesses can use this to give that to users. Like what you said, when you search, you look for you think about what would give you what you want in order to phrase your search item, or what would get what you want the most quickly. I think big companies can use that because they can understand what users are looking for, and if they have lots of examples of a search term that might give the user what they want, they can combine those examples and know that, okay, well, whenever a user searches for this, they always go to this item. And there's been lots of other occasions where this has also been the case. So with that knowledge, they can almost always guarantee that that's the first item you get, and that's what comes up first, for example.
Would you say there is a platform, either social or search, that has a fantastic knowledge graph already?
I do think, but
Go ahead. I was going to say, is there a leading company?
I would say Google or Wikidata. Wikidata is really great. They have loads of cool ways of showing how they store the data. I think maybe if you're more technical, Wikidata works better because you can see how they've labeled lots of things on their pages. So it kind of shows how they store things in their knowledge graph and how they've chosen to represent these items in their knowledge graph. Actually, if you were going to build one, I'd say like Wikidata is a great place to start and use to like play with and understand how to store things, because there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in order to do it. So I think it's a great way of showing you how you can work with it and deal with it. And in terms of Google, I mean, it's probably one of the first names you'll have ever heard, and because of its size. Yeah, pretty much because of its size, because of how much they are doing and how much they're out there and how much they're kind of everywhere. They have lots of resources, I want to say. I feel like they produce not documentation, but a fair few blogs and readings that you can use to supplement your knowledge. So I'd say both of them in different ways, but they both really help you in learning about them, and they kind of like show exactly how to, not show exactly how to use them, but give you really great examples. So they're probably the best in my opinion.
You mentioned there's a lot of groundwork. What sort of groundwork is required?
So for example, if you do go on Wikidata, you'll be able to see that they've had to label a lot of items. So if there was a page on a person, a movie actor, let's say, they would represent where the actor lives, maybe when they were born, maybe like any languages they speak or where they currently reside, like loads of those different things. But they all need to be stored differently in the graph. So like the actor is a person, their language is a language, their location could be a city, it could be a country, but those will have to be labeled or annotated so that you can store them in the graph in the right way. You can't just store something in the graph and expect the graph to know what you're trying to say. You have to tell it, because the idea is it's the same with databases or relational databases. When you add a new item to a table, you'd have a schema, so you know what each column is in relation to the schema. Like if you had an ID, you know that's probably an integer, it's probably a number, it's probably something that's just like representing like a row in the table. And then if you had a person, you'd have their first name, their surname. You know that would be a name, because when you enter new data into the table, it would conform to the schema. But if you're putting this into a graph, you need to be able to tell the graph what it is, so the graph knows, because otherwise it's just a bunch of text and it doesn't mean a lot. especially in data. It needs to be annotated so it can be used appropriately. Otherwise, there's just a bunch of free text there that doesn't mean anything, doesn't make much sense, and isn't very useful.
Wow. I say wow because I'm thinking of search. I'm someone who's studying search and social, right, from a macro point of view. And as you were just answering the question, I couldn't help but think of the way Google acquires information and the way social media platforms do. Google seeks or used to seek information, right? And the ordering, the organization of it wasn't as prominent or in a specific way to the way social media platforms do. Let's say IMDb, for example, you these platforms retrieve information, right? So if you're signing up to IMDb as a pro member, you input a bunch of information, which from my point of view, they use to easily build their knowledge graph. Whereas Google used to do it in a very old fashioned way compared to the way social media platforms do it. And they have more data set, but it wasn't necessarily organized. It was the term that you mentioned there, free text or something, where it's like, okay, it's information plentiful, but not necessarily facts about things or entities. So they have more information, but their way of acquiring information has to be updated, which is why knowledge graphs for Google is very important. Wow.
Yeah.
What's your
No,
take on all of
100%.
that? Oh, you agree?
No, I definitely agree. I think that's why, like I said earlier, there's so many roles, like being a taxonomist, being an ontologist, being a content architect, like all of those things come in to play when you're maintaining a graph. Like if you were maintaining a graph as big as Google, I'm sure Google has a lot of people who are involved with maintaining it, because another thing you mentioned, like IMDb, them asking people to enter information, that's great and that's helpful. But again, you wouldn't want to just blindly trust things your users are putting in. You would still need someone to validate these things. So they probably have someone on their team who's doing that as well. And then if you compare that to Google, who are doing that on like a much, much larger scale, they would need probably a few hundred, a few thousands of people doing that, because there's always new information as well. So it's not only making sure that your current information is up to date and is correct, but also accounting for all the new information that is coming in.
Would you say it's beneficial for a business to ensure that these platforms have the or corroborate with these platforms in some way or another to ensure that they have the facts about their business?
I guess yes. I think if you're a business, it's not going to hurt you, really. It's only probably going to benefit you or do nothing at all.
Because I'm thinking of,
So,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, I mean, just, yeah, like simply that. So helping them out, if anything, helps you out, and just make sure that they have the most up to date information about you and your business, which makes sense, as opposed to you're probably going to be there anyway, so why not make sure that it's valid and validated.
I'm thinking of Google My Business, and whenever there's a holiday season and the opening times are different and a business hasn't updated their holiday season opening and closing times, it's very
Yeah.
frustrating for
Yeah.
me as a
I think,
user.
yeah. No, like you said, if you're going to compare a business to another that has done it, then of course you'd be frustrated because you know that the capability is there. So why wouldn't they have done it if another business can?
Yeah.
It kind of comes back to like little things, and I've never been in the position where I've compared No, I guess maybe it has. Like, I don't think I've seen this. I think most of the time they are up to date. But if a supermarket, let's say, like compared one with another, one updates their holiday times and another doesn't, you're obviously going to go to the one with the updated timings to not run the risk of the other one being closed. And it might be that they're open, but again, it just means that you might be driving business away if you don't stay up to date with these things, because it's only going to help you if you do.
Over the Christmas period, I was keen to see the opening times of Pure Gym. I'm going to call them out because I think they really need to do a better job with their Google My Business listings during the holiday period. But they didn't update it. And it was very frustrating because I had to go through different channels, sources, linked, Google. I went to, Twitter, several Twitter pages, and they didn't update it. It was very disappointing, and I couldn't find it online. I had to I had to go in to see. The closest thing I saw online was a Twitter thread from them, Pure Gym, saying for the latest opening times during the Christmas period, have a look at your local branch. There'll be a poster on outside or something like that, which was very disappointing because I literally couldn't find the information online. I had to go in person to find that information, and I was looking for that information to decide what time to go to the gym. So it was quite a mess. But yes, that's something that definitely needs to be improved. I encourage all businesses that has a local branch to update local opening and closing times. Every business should know this about knowledge graphs. What would this be?
It doesn't work with the rest of your sentence, but know how they work and their pros and their cons, I'd say, most importantly, because I think if you don't understand how they work and what their benefits are, you might overlook them and think that you don't need to use them, when in reality, they could be very useful to you, your business, your use case, your product even. So just take the time to understand how they work, even on a basic level, why they might be useful, why they might not be, so you can decide for yourself whether it's something you want to invest time in.
What about for a person? In fact, every person who has an online presence, would you say the same for them, or would you say a slightly different thing?
I'd say just find out about them. Just like, you don't have to understand them in a great detail, but just read a little bit about it. Even Google's knowledge graph, I do think it's opening a lot. Now that it's becoming more of a common role, it's opening a lot of doors for somebody who's maybe working in data and like wants a bit of a change, because it's, from my experience anyway, it's something where I've been able to learn a lot and learn as I go, and not have to not feel like I need to have loads of experience, as long as I can demonstrate that I'm able to learn along the way. So it might open a whole new range of opportunities for you that you didn't know about. So just find out about it, because you never know.
Well said. Vaishali, thank you so much for your time today. Where's the best place for people to find you online?
On LinkedIn. My LinkedIn
LinkedIn.
is my full name. Yeah.
Okay, I'll have the link in the description so people can get in touch with you. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for being on, and we'll catch up again another time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Cheers. Bye now.